So, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Regenerative Soils Series. I'm Abby Rose. I'm co-founder of VitaCycle. At VitaCycle, we make digital tools to support regenerative farming, and that includes Soil Mentor, which helps farmers to learn what healthy soils look like and healthy soils and flourishing biodiversity look like above and below ground. Soil Mentor helps you to monitor and record changes and then use those observations to make informed decisions and keep everyone in the loop. This series of webinars explores the conversation around soil and taking a regenerative approach to farming through the lens of observation. So over the years, we noticed a pattern that many people who have a lot of success taking a regenerative approach, they're very confident taking the time to really look at their surroundings and then use those observations to inform their learning and decision making. And we've also noticed that many people are very cautious about spending time observing, mainly because it can feel unproductive or like a waste of time when they could be out actually doing something. So this series aims to highlight the power of observation, where and when observation can be a highly valuable tool, and also how observation has become a key part of our guests on-farm regenerative toolkit, or in Caroline's case, many farm regenerative toolkit. So this is our third interview of the series. Actually, no, it's our fourth, interview of the series, and it's with the very brilliant Caroline Grindrod. I remember when I first heard Caroline speak, I was just totally blown away. You're an amazing systems thinker, and you really bring that element into the regenerative approach and help people to really understand, like fundamentally, what it means to come from a regenerative perspective. And I think there's not that many people who can do that and who also have this like true farming experience and really able to place that and land that within what it means within a farm context or within a landscape context. So it's been amazing to kind of learn from you over the years. And obviously more recently, you've partnered with Claire Hill and done the Roots to Regeneration course. So that's a really kind of tangible way that people can get involved and learn from your amazing approach to things. As well as all the consulting you do. I know you work with some pretty large estates across the UK and maybe abroad, I don't know, helping them to transition the whole estate to take a more regenerative approach. So we're going to dig into some of that. But first off, I just wanted to ask you to introduce yourself really and tell us a bit about your business and relationship to farming today.
Thanks, Abby. Very kind introduction. Possibly not entirely worthy of it, but I'll do my best. Actually takes a little bit of time to think about what am I to start with. I think I am most recently I'm thinking of myself as a trainer, regenerative farm designer and coach, but probably more broadly, food and farming system kind of designer. So very much, like you say, evolved into this kind of being more of a systems thinker and thinking about this whole system transition, which is kind of my area of expertise. And in terms of where I am at the moment, I think of myself as having a kind of a three-cornered life, but mainly I spend most of my time between the Lake District, where I used to farm, but no longer farm, but still live. And of course, as a consultant, it's better that I don't farm. And then we are moving towards a life on the Isle of Lismore on what we're calling a kind of a regenerative living experiment. So it's a 4-acre croft, and it's being built quite slowly, I have to say. But the design and the future and everything is thinking about how do we apply these principles to how do we live as well as how do we farm. So there'll be a bit of farming, but not livestock there. And that keeps me nice and flexible. And then I have a third leg, which is that we spend quite a lot of time in our little old sailing boat traveling around the West Coast whenever I can get my online work kind of stacked up. So a kind of three-legged life between those three places.
Glorious. Sounds beautiful and very exciting that I love that you're actually practicing the principles that you're, sharing and consulting and coaching, and then also able to implement those on Lismore. That's really cool, and experimenting with what that looks like.
I'm trying to.
Definitely. So I wanted to start by talking a bit about, where you see observation fits into your training and coaching work? And maybe do you teach or talk about building an observation mindset when you are supporting farms to transition to this regenerative approach?
Yeah, and on a very sort of grounded practical level, that would look like soil and all the things that we'd immediately associate with observation and smelling, touching, and we use the kind of elemental conditions as the framework that I use. So thinking about the air, the soil, it's the earth, the fire and the photosynthesis, and all of that sort of aspect. So really trying to get farmers to be engaged in monitoring and observing, and of course I take a whole systems approach. So it's not just the soil, it's the plants, it's the animals, it's the whole system. So there's that kind of more practical level of observation. But I guess where my work really sits is in that kind of wider view of observation, which I would say, I'd think of as mindset. And that's a big part of my work. That's like absolutely foundational. And with Claire, as you mentioned, with Roots Regeneration, we have designed that course to be kind of using what we call the 50-40-10 framework, which is that 50% of, I think anyway, and from my work across many thousands of acres, doing more of a whole farm transition rather than just advising and doing practices, I've discovered that actually a successful regenerative farm transition is 50% mindset, how you think and look at the world and observe is part of that. And then when you've got that mindset, you can think about the design of your farm, which is 40% about designing the right farm. So designing out the problems and being proactive and making sure that that whole system of soil, plants and animals is all aligned. And then only 10% then comes on the back of that, which is where you would decide on what practices to apply to that farm design. And then the big part, which is kind of, I guess, another form of observation, is that the actual kind of role of a regenerative farmer is just getting moving with their regenerative plan around, aligned with the context they've developed, hopefully. And then a constant observation and feedback loop, which is it working? Is it giving me the results I thought it was? Is my soil improving? Is it, are there more birds? Are there more worms or whatever the thing is? And hopefully that's a whole stack of things across the system that they are tuning into and observing so that they can get the first feedback around if it's moving in the right direction. And that's why, my role is not an advisor. It's definitely a trainer, coach and designer to support them in that process, because they are the ones in the middle of that regenerating process. So I guess that's where I'd think about how observation fits in. It's, we can definitely talk about it in the most practical, tangible terms, but it's that bigger mindset piece, I would say.
Mm. Yeah, and you gave me a good example of like what, it's all very well to like go put a cover crop in, but if you're housing cattle indoors 7 months of the year and have a conventional system using fertilizers, like it's not going to change. Like the design and the mindset need to be core. And
Yeah,
that was really
exactly. And I had a conversation with a soil health advisor who was like, the biggest thing that you can do in your system to make it more profitable or whatever is improve your soil. And of course, I'm a huge advocate of soil health and improving the soil, and of course, Soil Mentor we use as our baselining. But at the same time, as if I go into a farm, and particularly because I work in the uplands, I get this situation all the time. So it's maybe even more obvious to me is that, we've got huge upland landscapes where, they might be, like you say, housing for 6 or 7 months. They might be buying in straw, buying in feed. And then, okay, maybe in summer, and they might be carrying many more livestock than the land can actually carry because they're importing all of that feed and fertility, or what we call ghost acres. And if that's the case, then simply doing a bit of mob grazing or putting some amendments on to try and fix your soil is really not going to fix it's not going to get you to a regenerative system. So that's where that bigger mindset piece and that design piece in particular comes in. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so in terms of these observations, I mean, we've talked about multi-layered observations in a way. Is it possible to teach that? How can people develop the ability to observe and then make decisions based on these observations?
Yeah, of course, that leads beautifully on from the last question, which is that's what the Roots Regeneration program was designed to do, is actually do this 50-40-10. So the whole thing is designed around helping people shift and again, it sounds like a cliche, we hear it all the time, the paradigm shift, but ultimately that is the crux of becoming a really great regenerative farmer or regenerator more broadly. And of course, we hear the story, we read the books, Gabe Brown and the others, they've had that breaking moment that's kind of broken their mind down. And then out of that, they've developed a more holistic or different way of solving that problem. And that's what I would call that kind of mind shift from first tier thinking down up to sort of second tier thinking, which is you can be more holistic, you can see the whole picture, you can become a systems thinker. And it's absolutely something that you can teach. And that's what we do as part of our processes. Yes, we definitely teach the kind of practical stuff, and we definitely teach through the lens of soils and plants and animals. But all of those lessons are also teaching systems thinking and more holistic ways of looking at things. And over that kind of year to 2 year process, it's a complete paradigm shifting experience. So it's definitely something that we need to have a kind of cultural support around. It's very much a transformational experience. And there's a couple of ways that we teach that in particular that are useful. One is a process called the red flag process, which is a great tool for systems thinking. And that's where we look at any problems or diseases or weeds or just any kind of issue in the farmed system that's out of we think of that as an imbalance. So it's an indicator that we've got an imbalance in the system. Because ultimately a species only shows up if you've created the conditions in the habitat and the food it needs. And it shows up in abundance if it's not got any regulation from the top down or competitors or parasites. So we can then think of it very differently. We can think, instead of it just being a weed that you have to go and kill and it's a problem over and over again, or a parasite, you just trying to kill it in a slightly less toxic way, that we can rethink that, and we can think about it in terms of how you would as an ecologist. And it's like, well, what have we done to create the conditions that that species can thrive in? And usually that's all of the typical things that we see in, when you're trying to move into a regenerative system. Is, you've got compacted soil, your plants are monoculture or low diversity, your system is designed wrong, your animals might be a mismatch, blah, blah, blah. So we can look at that ecologically and think, okay, well, how can we reduce the conditions that that problem species needs? And how can we increase and amplify the predation and the competition and the parasites that would regulate that population? And when you think about that completely differently, I guess that's another form of observation. You make different decisions, don't you? You try and address the root cause of why that thing has turned up, and you design that out of your system as far as you can. Sometimes it's impossible to totally get rid of it, but so that's another example of how you would teach kind of systems thinking. Is we use that tool quite a lot. And then we also teach, as part of Roots to Regeneration anyway, the sit spot. So we usually try and encourage farmers to, or anyone, because we teach professionals and farmers together, to sit down and find somewhere in their environment that's a great place to sit and observe and watch the seasons change and watch what plants are thriving at different times of the year. And tune into the kind of the sounds and the smells, and just teach that process of being aware. And great regenerative farmers are absolutely amazing at this. They can see things very quickly, but that's not a skill that everyone has at all, for sure. So yeah, it's definitely something you can teach. And then I guess the final piece is that we also teach as part of Roots Regeneration different ways of knowing. So similar vein, it's like we are very caught up in our mind and coming up with solutions from our mind, and in the West in particular, and at the sort of stages of development that we mostly are. But actually, there's other sort of underdeveloped ways of knowing, like this sensing and intuition and various other things that, again, sitting quietly, taking yourself out of the system, and developing that awareness is really important in terms of being a successful regenerative farmer.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I think it's really helpful that you kind of codify, a sit spot or the red flag method, because in a way, telling someone to just observe, I think it's a really daunting concept. And you sit there and you think, oh, what am I meant to be seeing? And you can get really stuck in your head. And you can think, well, how long am I meant to be here? And like, we're so stuck in our productive mindsets, especially on farm, because there's so many other things you could be doing, that without having those sort of methodologies, let's call them, that give you a structure of what you're meant to be doing in that moment, it's actually, yeah, I think it's one of the most daunting things there is. So it's so cool that you've been able to like codify those and give those methods to people and give them permission, I guess.
That's certainly what I try to do is turn very complex, difficult, not particularly tangible things into something that you can kind of slightly wrap your head around. Not always brilliantly, but that's what that's the big effort, isn't it? Is to try and help people understand these big woolly concepts and make them quite practical and understandable and achievable.
Totally, totally. And yeah, maybe like what would you say to a farmer that doesn't feel confident making decisions based on their observations yet? Like where should they start or where could they start?
Well, I mean, that, as I say, that sit spot, the two things that spring to mind are that, finding a spot to just sit and I mean, actually, it was actually Sharon Blackie in her book, that originally came up with this idea of sitting somewhere and taking a picture regularly and revisiting the same place, and I loved that. And then I sort of evolved that into working with farmers, and so doing that as a practice is great. But then thinking through the lens of the elemental conditions is how I teach it in holistic management. It's ecosystem processes, but it's the same sort of thing. Basically, is as you're walking around, look down. You should be observing, the density of all the things that you do in Soil Mentor. It's like on the soil surface as you're walking around, you can be observing all of those things, and then stopping and smelling and listening and tuning in. And the humans are an incredible barometer for aliveness, aren't they, if that's a thing. And actually, Claire and I have been talking for a while, and I think we've actually built it into our Soil Mentor profile. We've got this score, I think, which is basically just like tuning in and what's the kind of general sense of aliveness that you're getting from this place. And that's one of the ways that we can help people link that to, oh, well, that's the same place that we've got great plant diversity, or great habitat structure, or whatever the thing is, and then they can start to use that as a proxy, and then they become the kind of like barometer as they're walking around, and that's the ultimate end point, isn't it?
Totally. Yeah, and so empowering because suddenly you really are able to trust yourself
Yeah, absolutely.
as the barometer. Okay, great. So maybe we could talk. Obviously, you have the privilege of seeing many different contexts and different people who are going through or have been through this process of the regenerative transition. I mean, so maybe you could share some examples of where an observation or taking this approach and this mindset has led someone you work with to make different decisions or a breakthrough moment in their understanding. I don't know if you have any specific examples.
Well, I think it's just as a more general thing, and I guess where I have had breakthrough was, when I suddenly realized that rather than trying to be an advisor, so this kind of applies to them as well, but rather than trying to be an advisor and go in the conventional sense, when I came out, I sort of trained in regenerative approaches, and I thought, yeah, I just need to kind of take the role of a farm advisor and go in and tell them about regenerative stuff instead of the conventional stuff, and of course very quickly realized that doesn't work at all, because this is such a different thing that we're talking about here. This is a process, a very long process. So when I had that kind of aha moment of like, actually, no, what I'm here to do is like train them in the principles. They can't simply go in and tell them what to do. That's never going to work, because if their job as a regenerator is to be in a constant feedback loop with observation, that's not happening if I write a report. So they've got to learn how to be and do that to some degree. Now, there's very basic ways you can start with that process. It doesn't have to be a 2-year R2R program, but just teaching some of those skills that we just talked about. And then supporting them, training them, and then helping them co-design, I call it. So instead of me going in and saying, I think this design would work, it's really the first thing that I do is go in with a farming family. So this is where they have the breakthrough and I have the breakthrough, is that what I think I'm quite good at is spending the day just traveling around and listening into them, and asking questions and chatting. But in that process of, going around the farm, looking at the land, me tuning into what I can see and hear and sense about it, as a reasonably well-trained barometer, and then listening and asking questions about them and their system, what they want, what's their aspirations, what are their goals. You get a kind of a sense, if you're a very good systems thinker, of kind of the nodes that are off balance, or what are the little points in that system that would unlock, that whole design. And from there, you can start poking and asking more questions, and then they have their insights around, oh, well, if we really thought about it differently, or if we didn't, have to make hay all the time, then we could not, be in wintering our cows or whatever. So you can help them have those aha moments about the whole system. And that's where you can get sort of major breakthroughs. And again, back to that soil advisor kind of conversation, you can't get that level of breakthrough if you're just looking at improving the soil outside of everything else, so I guess, yeah, when I suddenly realized that I was no longer an advisor and my job was coming in as this kind of more systems level, that was a big breakthrough for me. And that's where I started having the breakthroughs with the farmers, and they were having their breakthroughs. So I guess that's the big different framing.
So exciting to be able to bring that and be part of it.
And then it's ongoing. So then you end up in, and again, I don't work with like hundreds of different farms. I work with a kind of, I don't know, a couple of dozen maybe, but and probably no more than 20, in a year. More deeply. I mean, I do training. We have our R2R cohort that's separate, and then I do kind of things like the grazing school, where we were teaching, hundreds over the year on a very sort of surface level introduction. But in terms of my bespoke consultancy, I have a handful of clients that are multiple years, and of course a lot of those are big estates, and it needs that level of investment. But mostly that's because once we've done the training and the design, the whole process of it's coaching them through that feedback loop. So they're out there doing their grazing plan, observing what's happening, and then I'm regularly checking in with them and saying, how's it going? What do we need to replan? And it's just an entire process. So that can last multiple years. And sometimes a really light touch, after that initial sort of work. But yeah, so I think that's all part of this very different way of thinking about working with these farms.
Yeah. And how much, one of the things I'm interested in is, obviously we're talking about observation, but in a way to complement this observation and these frameworks, it is also about building people's confidence and their knowledge. So I was just curious, how much of that ongoing coaching is actually, one, just about building confidence, but then also, where does knowledge building fit into all of this? You kind of inferred it for your Roots to Regeneration course, but also with the training of a whole estate. Yeah, how does that all fit together? How do you think about that?
I've got a framework for everything. So I lean really heavily on integral theory, which uses something called the all quadrants, all levels framework. And essentially, in a nutshell, that is, if you're looking at anything, so that could be looking at your personal life, your farm design, or your farm transition, how to design an organization and transition that. So any one of those problems, you can look at it through these four quadrants. So basically, and if you want to have a successful transition, you need to be thinking about training in all of those four quadrants. So everything that I design, whether that's a farm or my training programs, and R2R in particular is very well and carefully designed using this approach. You need to be thinking about the upper left part of that quadrant, which is the inner world. So that's what we talked about, the paradigm shift, the different ways of looking, the different ways, observation would fit in there, different ways of thinking about things, different ways of knowing. You need to change their mindset. And then you need to also look at the upper right, which is where most regenerative training falls, and that's where teaching practices, learning about soil health, all the tangible things that you can read about or learn about, or using Soil Mentor would be another great way of that's in there. So again, that's such a great tool, because it's not just measuring baselines, it's teaching people how to think about these things all the time, and it's getting them observing, of course. So that's in the upper right. So you definitely need to do that. And as part of R2R, for instance, we've got deep modules on soil health, plant systems, animal systems, farm design, all of that is all very much structured there to learn as an important part of that puzzle. But on its own, it's just not anywhere near enough. And as I said, most regenerative training tends to focus in on that point. And that's maybe why we don't get such, particularly with some of these big kind of corporate farm transition sort of things, they're not covering any of these other aspects. So, and then you've got your kind of lower left, which is the cultural and the community. So I've had this for years, especially in the early days of teaching regenerative agriculture, where nobody else around them knew what it was, and they looked like complete weirdos out on a limb doing something really radical. If you haven't got people that taught your language or reinforce your paradigm, it's really easy to slip back into old ways of doing things. So if you don't address the cultural aspect and the community aspect, then you're really going to have quite a weak transition that's likely to fail. And then the lower right is something that we've got less control over, but that's where you'd look at like external structures, things like policy and governance, and that's maybe the wider, for me, with R2R, what we realized, and Claire and I realized, is just working on farms is not enough. We need, if we want to have a regenerative future across the food and farming system, we need vets, we need agronomists, we need economists, we need the whole spectrum of people that are influencing where that lands, so that's where we've decided that we wanted to bring half farmers, half professionals, we call them, which is basically people in the food and farming system and beyond, actually, who also want to use regenerative principles to design their little piece of this world that we're trying to create in the future. And if we get all those 4 quadrants, so the inner world, the kind of the things we can learn, the cultural, surrounding yourself with the right people, and of course, in our cohorts, we've got 2 years and beyond where they're supporting each other, they're getting to know each other, it's trusted group, they can fall back if somebody's pushing them, and ask questions, and we've got their back. So, and then of course we're also trying to make sure that we're influencing the wider system and, governance, and putting out white papers and things that matter in terms of shifting the thinking around this stuff. Then we hopefully can make a significant impact in transitioning towards a regenerative food and farming system beyond each individual farm, which is really, what we're about. So, yeah.
Yeah. So exciting. And yeah, it is really helpful to think of those 4 quadrants, because I definitely feel like the majority of the regenerative conversation falls in that one quadrant of the knowledge building and learning, practical things, let's say, or things you could implement easily. But actually, in a way, that's what led us to want to do this series.
Yeah.
Is like, how can we start to talk about that mindset quadrant in it's almost like a more robust way. And, you've created clever little skill building exercises to help people understand what it means. And I think it's difficult. I think it's people find it kind of abstract to understand what it really means.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
the frameworks are very helpful to think through these things.
Sure.
I agree with you there. Okay, I just wanted to maybe just thinking at the level of patterns now. So I know you have, maybe you could share what it means to start to spot patterns, especially like before problems develop within a farming system. How can you start to see those trends, and how do you codify that?
Yeah, and again, partly we teach that through the kind of ways of knowing. So if you are in the fight, in the stress, like in it all the time, and you're using your mind to try and make decisions, then you're never going to be able to spot patterns and see the bigger picture. So the first thing is like all the exercises that we talked about kind of ways of knowing, your emotional senses, your intuition, using beyond your mind, and that requires either using like the skills like your sit spot and things, but also just taking time out of your system. So, my answer to everything is like, go and sit in the woods. If I've ever got a kind of problem to solve, it's like I'll frame the problem really clearly, and then I'll go and get myself away from the problem and be thinking about something else. So when you're on your walk, or if you're walking the dog, or you're going on your bike ride, or whatever your thing is, and some farmers don't do that and get the chance to be away from the farm, that's part of the problem. So giving them permission to, either get themselves away from the farm or get themselves away from the stress of that particular decision, is how you spot, patterns, I think. And yeah, but also just sitting, instead of like rushing around on a quad bike. Regenerative farmers are doing things really differently, and we're trying to encourage them to sit and just watch their cows. And again, through that process of observing, you're grounding yourself into you're out of your mind, aren't you? So you're allowing space for other things to drop in, and you can solve problems from that place, which you can't solve from just the level of mind. So I think that's a big part, and that's what I would call, pattern recognition, is kind of spotting that thing ahead, isn't it? That's going to derail you, and having that insight. But you're right, pattern recognition is one of the kind of hallmarks of a system thinker, or, a regenerative farmer or a regenerative system person. And then how we teach that very tangibly is we've got our own, I've developed 12 regenerative design principles. So unlike, the kind of the 5 or 6 principles of soil health that everyone's quite familiar with, I don't teach those. I teach them as part of kind of, just explaining that that's part of soil health. But because I take that kind of broader systems view, I think of those more of like rules of good soil health. But the broader kind of thinking about regenerative systems is that actually, in a nutshell, what a regenerative design process is about is saying, how does nature work, observing how nature works, and then drawing patterns out of that, or principles as I call them, but the same thing you could call it a pattern, to then apply to whatever you're designing. So there's as I say, I've got 12 that I use, but it's things like, nature works in seasons and cycles, and nature is fractal, and nature is decentralized, and organizes through communication networks. And it's those sort of broad principles of how nature works. And so we teach that through the lens of farm, obviously. How do we design a farm using those principles? And then we teach that through, regenerative leadership. So how do you use, and some people, every lineage of regenerative agriculture has, so certainly the kind of the higher level lineages have got these built in somewhere. There's a permaculture principles. There's, some people call it living system logic. Everyone's got their own way of describing this, but it's essentially, in a nutshell, using how nature works and applying it to your whatever the thing is you're designing. So by teaching those 12 principles, and then teaching people to see them in different places. So next week we're doing a workshop on, we've done a workshop on designing their own organizations, and we've spent quite a bit of time on sort of regenerative leadership and regenerative organizational design. And then we're going to be kind of doing a visioning workshop where we're looking at designing the food and farming system of the future, which is, we've only got 2 hours, so I don't know what we're going to manage to achieve, but using those 12 principles. So it's like training people and thinking about how would nature design this, and loads of cool people have done this. In terms of, economics and architecture. My husband's a builder. We're doing it for his business. You can apply them to anything. And that really teaches what I would call pattern recognition. And when you've got that, you don't need to know all of the detail, like that upper right quadrant that we talked about, all those facts and figures. What tends to happen in people that are into regenerative is they get to a point of, they've learned lots, they've watched every YouTube video and read loads of books, and then they think that what has to happen then is they have to specialize and get deeper, like more, I need to know more about soil organisms, I need to know more about soil chemistry, and they dive deep and deep and deep and narrow. Whereas I would say actually what needs to happen more is that you need to broaden out and come back out to look at that big picture, that more holistic, and that's where the frameworks come in, and that bigger observational capacity comes in. It's like, fine, if you want to specialize in fungi, in the soil, that's great. We need people that can do that too. But there's a level of knowing enough, and I did the same thing. I kind of went down, I've read so many books and learned so deeply about things, and it's like, well, it's still not going to help me design a great farm. So actually sitting back and learning the observational skills and that kind of wider, broader way of looking at things is incredibly important. Is the next stage of their regenerative journey. So Yeah, all
Yeah.
of that.
Yeah, no, and I think also what I hear when I start to hear your examples of your 12 regenerative principles, um, is that also they help inform confidence when you are looking. Like when I'm looking, I start to know, or I start to notice, oh yeah, that does work cyclically, or oh yeah, and it kind of gives you a language or a way of understanding things. I think that's really interesting.
Exactly. And actually, that's a really good point is that people get a bit caught up in this, like, well, is it five principles or is it this or is it that? And it's like, well, actually, all great regenerative practitioners, trainers, whatever, are really just looking at nature and seeing how nature works. And we're just using different language and wrappers to describe that. So there is no right answer. It's like there's no four, ecosystem processes. Nature didn't put them into four segments. Nature's just doing nature, and then we're describing it in different ways. So I think that's why people get a bit hung up on it. But so lots of people wrap it up differently, and that's great. We want
Mhm.
diversity. But ultimately, it is just like you say, it's just giving you a common language to use when you're training in this stuff so that you can refer to different examples and things. So that's what we do.
Yeah, totally. That's amazing. So I wanted to just dig into one example that you told me about, where you saw like observations directly affecting, or observations and this whole mindset shift, I guess, and changing the design approach on farm and how that helps improve farm profitability, and resilience. And you shared an example of a fellow farmer in the Lake District, and how their system completely shifted. I don't know if you.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a few examples, but I think James and Helen Rebanks are, I've been working with a very long time, and over the hill, Sam and Claire at Garborough, a very similar length of time. But I think because James's farm was on, had already been a reasonably good starting point because his dad had, well, his grandfather managed it very well and very traditionally. And then I don't, if they had used fertilizer, it's a fairly short, venture down that route. And then really, I think economics stopped them doing a lot of that. So their soil health hadn't been destroyed. It is already a kind of not too bad starting point. But it was still very much a kind of overgrazed, very typically grazed Lake District hill farm, with fell rights. I mean, the fell, I would say there's not much change probably because it's very little you can actually change up on the fell if all your commoners are not doing anything differently anyway. But on the in-by ground, James and Helen have done just an incredible job of what I would call a whole system design and transition. And because of that ability to be deeply into the system and tuned in to what needs to be done, and because they've got a long lineage of being on that farm and sort of seeing it through the different eras. So and James thinks very deeply about all of this stuff and particularly about design. So he used he had once he learned about the kind of principles of how to grow more grass and soil health and all of that stuff, he took it. He's also just a high achiever. Well, they both are. So everything is done to the highest level with a really deep thinking around it. So they were absolutely brilliant at using all the grants and things that are available to put in fences, put in ponds, put in hedges, plant trees, and design a farmed landscape that enhances all of those elemental conditions that I talk about. So reducing the velocity of air and extreme weather by putting hedges and tall grass and trees everywhere, and improving soil health through all the things that we know in terms of good grazing. And they already had a reasonably good baseline for species diversity, and maximizing through good grazing, photosynthesis, and then of course water, very much capturing every drop of rainfall that comes onto that land, which is quite a lot in the Lake District, I have to say, but then making sure it's retained in ponds and as I say, deep soils, it's not saturated. So they really took that kind of design approach and are a great example of thinking about the whole system. The soils are healthy and they're sequestering carbon and alive. You've got the next level up, which is you've got plant diversity through good grazing and good management, plus all the hedges and all the other habitats built into that system. And then the really big huge gains have been that they went down the route of deciding what type of breed they shifted from. I mean, they actually had a reasonable breed to start with, but they wanted to go into, the already is obviously very well known for being a Herdwick shepherd, but very much got into the cattle breeding on the Belted Galloway side. And it's, of course, it's a big part of a whole system transition is making sure we've got the right animals for the plants and the soils and the environment we're in. So he not only chose a great breed for that particular site, and of course a Belter Galloway isn't great for everywhere by any means, but for that site it's extremely good. And then of course he also is extremely good on the genetic selection. So getting the right animals to start with, and then very rapidly taking that observer feedback loop in a very structured way, in his case, monitoring every animal, scoring it, deciding which animals to keep really strategically. That means that he's optimized that system to such a high level. It's just mind-blowing. And then the wider outer ring is that kind of like environmental piece that I talked about with the elemental, the design of the environment is now aligned with all of that, soil, plants, animals, and their own, mindset within that. So yeah, I would say that. And now he's just been crunching some figures, and I'm trying to write it up as a case study, and I'm terrible at remembering figures, but compared to the AHDB baselines, which is each beef cow per year is making at the very best is a £600 profit, but most are making £1,000 loss a year when you take out of subsidies and all the rest of it. He's making per cow a £2,000 profit per cow per year. And so, although that is partly to do with being a really good breeder, and having a name for the Belter Galloways and the pedigrees, I've done the numbers based on just selling into a store market, and it still works. It's just that he's done such a lot of work on the whole system design that's made the difference. So it's given me a great deal of confidence, because he takes on rubbish land, that he can. It's not. We're not talking about, really good land. We're talking about rushy, boggy, Yorkshire foggy land, and he's getting the better results in terms of profitability on a cow than anyone else I've ever worked with. So I would say that's a pretty good example of whole system design.
Absolutely. Yeah, and as I said, I got to visit in the last year, and it felt amazing being there. It just felt so alive. Talk about that kind of
Aliveness score.
senseness. Yeah, it was like, wow, this is working.
Especially in summer, and looking at some photos of before, I got to know them, but what the landscape, I can't believe it's the same landscape. And actually that's the problem at grazing school now, is we get people turning up and we get, oh well, it's all right for you, you've got all this shelter and shade and lovely soils. It's like, that's not what it was like. So yeah, sometimes you need to take on that new land to show them what it started like. So
yeah, it begins.
Place.
Okay, I wanted to also just understand a little bit about your evolution in terms of learning, and how has the way you see things evolved as you've learned more? What are kind of some of your more recent insights or thoughts? Just in general, it doesn't have to be about observation necessarily.
Yeah, and again, another framework as part of the integral theory actually is this sort of spiral dynamics is one way of describing it, but developmental psychology, which is that everybody goes through these very predictable patterns of change. Again, it's patterns. It'll look really different for everybody. Everybody's culture is going to be different, everybody's upbringing, but you will go through certain worldview changes that are quite predictable. So I guess I've just been working my way through those. I can see, look back now, and I can see where even when I started teaching regenerative, and I would have considered myself a holistic thinker right back then, but I still had quite a partial view compared to now. So I think what's really changed is just I'm able to handle more and more wider views, more complexity, more systems thinking. And when you move into this kind of second tier level, you can start to see all the ways that you can shape the system and where people are on the journey and where systems are on their journey. And Gregory Landauer and Ethan Soloviev did a great I think it's called The Levels of Regenerative Agriculture piece, which maps actually with spiral dynamics. And that's a great framing actually, because it shows that at the kind of the lower levels of people adopting regenerative agriculture, it's very much about that upper right practices, like just need to do no-till, or you just need to do a bit of mob grazing and it'll all be fine. And of course the challenge is that a lot of the big corporates are bringing it in on that basis, aren't they? And it doesn't work that well. And that's a great starting point. But if you've already got a system that's designed with the science and thinking of the green revolution, and then you're just slapping some practices onto it, you're not going to get very far. So the next level up from that is thinking about the farm as a kind of, all right, it's maybe not just soil health, it's maybe about, plants and, what we just talked about, a few bits around design, and maybe it's contextual and different in different places, and so you're sort of broadening it out and thinking about it a little bit more holistically. And that's a brilliant next step. And then you take it to the next level. And of course, these are not very strong, they're not really levels in that sense. It's just a way of it's a way of understanding it and having a language around it. And the next level up would be where you would be thinking about a whole paradigm shift. So it's it's the worldview shift that you have to be a calmer systems thinker, to think of yourself as part of that farm system, not separate from it. And think about root cause and all those other things. And then you start to realize kind of somewhere up that journey that it's not just about farm transition, that if that farm is going to succeed, it needs to be part of a whole system that's also supporting it. The way that the food is bought, the way that the food and farming system is structured is going to have an influence on that. The way that the advisors support you, the way that the land agents are advising you, all needs to be part of this kind of system. Otherwise, you're just constantly butting up against problems and resistance, people from a kind of more mechanistic perspective. So that's kind of that next level. And then the final level, I think, is maybe where my work is moving into, which is realizing that a lot of indigenous cultures really understood regeneration very deeply. And actually, although we sometimes frame this as a new thing that's come in, and particularly because a lot of the regenerative practitioners have come from the US and Australia, it's like we're bringing in all these experts and to teach us about regeneration. And a big evolution of mine has been to suddenly get very interested in that rooting process, as I call it, which is learning about our UK lineage. We have had some amazing, if you look back deeply into the past, and you start reading some of these really early books on farming and ecology, and we had some amazing thinkers in this country, so many, and I'm writing a piece on it called The Reweaving of Regenerative Agriculture at the moment, so I'm doing lots of research. But people like Fraser Darling in Scotland, who was doing this stuff in the 30s and 40s, and writing about the fact that social ecology tracks with the actual ecology in the West Highlands, and looking at the crofting and how that could be improving soil health, and describing the living soil in ways that he didn't have the science at the time, but is describing what we do now. And so many other amazing people in our own lineage, and some of the practices in the crofting tradition, and some of the traditional hill practices in their true sense, not the kind of slightly shadow version that we're now seeing, but in the original way that these were managed, with shepherding and different species up on the high fells, and the hay meadow systems and things. They were really regenerative systems, which have started to get kind of watered down over time because these new tools came in. But I'm super interested in, as I say, when you get to that kind of higher level of regenerative agriculture, you start to think about the fact that we need entire systems designed, and it needs to be bioregionally designed. So we need to have, instead of having some blanket tick box exercise of doing regenerative agriculture across the world that everyone can agree on and we can all measure, it should never look like that, because true regeneration should be using nature's principles to design it, in which case it's going to be bioregionally different. So really what I'm interested now is, how can we take those patterns and start to inspire rooted, very bioregionally aligned regenerative sort of hubs or networks, or work in those different places that's going to look really different, but it's going to have those similar patterns. And then reweaving some of that important lineage from our own UK, so that we can create a true kind of UK regenerative lineage that feels much more grounded. And then when you get the naysayers saying things like, well, regenerative agriculture is not just another buzzword, it's like, well, no, it is, if we just take this imported version that's tick boxes. But if we actually reroute and reweave into that UK lineage, and then come back with that, then I think we could be in a very different place. So that's that's my big piece of work at the moment, and that's of course woven into everything that I do. So
I can't wait to read it and hear more. Because I feel like, yeah, that's definitely something there is a lack of easy access to anyway. Is like what is the rootedness of being on the land in the UK, let's say, and who are the different people who over time have led the thinking on that. I definitely don't know, and I guess it's something at Farmerama we've tried with the landed series. We looked into it a little bit about um, a Scottish farm in the Highlands, but still, yeah, there's so much to learn, and that's really exciting. And I wonder, well, I should have said at the beginning that if people did have questions, they can put them in the Q&A. But I have one more question right now, which is I know you wrote that kind of, I wouldn't call it a white paper necessarily, but very clear outline of what is, a lot of people are saying, oh, the word regenerative is just greenwashing these days, and oh, it doesn't work anyway, or and the risks around that. And I think it was really interesting that you um, kind of further clarified why you think that that isn't just completely the case, and maybe you could just talk a little bit about that
yeah, of course.
clarification.
And I guess that all of that, what I've just said about levels and things, sets it up nicely because really what I was saying was that I think I can see a divergence into two types of regenerative agriculture. And one, if you're thinking through the lens of these levels of how we apply, and of course we've got these lineages. So holistic management is a lineage, permaculture is a lineage. All of them are legitimate, and they have slightly different ways of describing regeneration and a living system. But ultimately, I think what's going to happen is it's going into two. It's breaking in two, and I think that's a good thing because I think we shouldn't describe as true regenerative agriculture. One is where you're just going in and you're saying, if you sign up to this program and you do these 5 things and you tick those boxes, you can call yourself regenerative. To me, that's what I'm not trying to be really critical of that because it's still a great step forward, but it's not what I would call a true regenerative system. And it's fine, but really let's call it what it is, which is you're adopting some regenerative practices, but you can't really call yourself a regenerative farmer unless you can measure that you're regenerating, which is where things like soil mentor comes in. So as long as they are tick boxing and measuring some outcomes, and okay, we might only be just measuring things like soil health, water infiltration, or earthworms, or whatever. Still great, fine. But then there's this other thing that I kind of tend to be more involved in, which is that whole paradigm shift. What we've just said about bioregional kind of more, and that's where I think what will happen is people will realize that it's so much more than that, and it needs to be a systems level approach. And I think that the other piece is that we'll start to rediscover some of the lineages that I think have got a bit forgotten, which is kind of the true organic farming. Again, organic farming became a bit of a tick box exercise as well, but the original thinking behind organic farming is absolutely regenerative. Things like biodynamics, permaculture, they've been around a really long time, and we should be recognizing them as true regenerative lineages. So I think there'll be a bit of a renaissance of those sorts of things. And then I think what I was saying about developing this UK rooted lineage, that's what I also hope will happen is people will start to find roots and reweave kind of some of the original thinkers back into our own lineage, and we can start to sort of rediscover we haven't got a complete indigenous line through our history in the UK, but we can start to think about what that might have looked like, and we can start to re-engage with that process of trying to understand what indigeneity might be for us. So, and I think that's a really important piece of this is like going through your own rooting to place process of learning about from deep time right the way through to who were the people in this region in this place through time. What did they do? What was the original traditional farming like? What other industry was in this area? What did the green revolution look like here? What technologies did we come out of that were useful, and then go through all the parts of the history of the place to start to get a sense of what is the essence and story of this place, so that you can then come out with a true kind of like more rooted way of being a regenerator in that place. So I think that it's going to be I think people, I hope, This is my hope, is that people will start to recognize that that's what true regenerative agriculture is, and slightly call out this other thing, which is useful and important, but it's not the same. So I guess that was the thinking there.
Yeah, and it's helpful to draw out the distinction very clearly because then people can make the distinction for themselves. Because I think at the moment it is just all one big kind of melange of
Exactly.
um,
And then
everyone doing
it's
slightly different
like
things.
people saying, oh, it means different things to different people. Well, that's why, because we haven't got this clear framing of these different aspects. So that's what I tried to do, is frame it, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. Okay, I'm going to say, well, thank you so much for everything. I don't know if there's anything I missed that you wanted to share, or maybe I think Roots to Regeneration has just uh, started a new cohort. Is
Yeah,
that
we're just
right?
in our one-on-ones. It starts at the end of March. Yeah, so we've got a full house, which is brilliant. But
Brilliant. So people could sign up for next year's course
yeah,
if they wanted to.
absolutely.
And then you do your grazing schools in the summer in the Lake District. Is that right?
Got a grazing school in July with James and Helen. And we are kickstarting through Wilderculture several bioregional projects with farmer networks. So if you're in a region, watch out for that, because we're just kicking off one in the Cairngorms. There's other ones emerging. So if you are in a region, reach out and I can see. I'm going to be putting on the website very soon an opt-in for people on the Wilderculture website, so that if you're in a region and you want to become part of that network, then hopefully we can find funding and sponsor this kind of full 2-year transition in a region. But
Wow.
and the regenerative consultancy I'm a little bit over capacity with, but there's still, by all means, email if there's I am working with some other people now to help deliver that. So that's also an option as well. Even if it might not be me on the farm myself, I'm a little bit spread a bit thin.
I would never have guessed with all, and you have your primal meats business as well. I
Yes,
mean, it's just
yes.
amazing. Um, but it's all part of, I guess, what it takes to shift a system. And so you're thinking about all the different parts and pulling them along. And I feel
That's the
similar.
curse of, yeah, I'm sure you do, because you're a systems thinker. That is the curse of being a systems thinker. You can't just stop with one little piece of it, can you?
No, it's a nightmare. But anyway, thank you so much, Caroline, for sharing all of your learnings and to people who've tuned in. Um, and if you enjoyed this session, then please sign up to our newsletter to find out more about future episodes. And also, probably next week, beginning of next week now, maybe end of this week, we'll send out the recording from this episode. And we'll send some links to your different websites and projects so that people can follow that up and get involved. And yeah, you can head to the Regen Soils Hub on our website to rewatch previous episodes as well. And if you'd like to find out a bit more about Soil Mentor and how it can support you in building an observation mindset and making your observations as valuable as possible, then please do email us on info@vitacycle.com, or you can head to our website, which is soils.vitacycle.com, and sign up to hear more.